our last speaker is Jim Leape. Jim has more than 3 decades of conservation experience spanning a broad range of conservation issues across the globe. Through research, writing, and direct engagement with private and public sector leaders, Jim looks at how to drive large-scale systemic shifts to sustainability, with particular interest in expanding private sector leadership on sustainability globally. Jim received his bachelor's from Harvard College and a JD from Harvard Law School. He is currently the William and Eva Price Senior Fellow in the Stanford Woods Institute of the Environment, and he also serves as co-director of the Center for Ocean Solutions.
I want to talk to you about blue foods. This really picks up with where Ali started, which is the central challenge of figuring out how do we illuminate the relevance of our issues to the interests of decision makers who matter. And in this context, how do we bring blue foods into the heart of decision making about the future of food systems around the world? This is a project that has been led by the Center for Ocean Solutions and the Center for Food Security and the Environment over the last 3 years. So all of us know that one of the central challenges we face in sustainability is feeding 10 billion people within the limits of this planet. Agriculture is already a major driver of deforestation, of biodiversity loss, of the overuse of freshwater resources, and a significant contributor to climate change. And of course, a lot of that is the production of animal-sourced protein. About 80% of all the land used for food production is used to support livestock. And so somehow we have to find a way to take advantage of the possibilities of blue foods. Not these blue foods, although they're also good for you, but instead the food that we produce in the water. So we're talking animals, plants, algae produced in the ocean or in freshwater, captured or cultivated. These are foods that are already important. Blue foods are a primary source of nutrition for about 3 billion people around the world. They are also a source of about 800 million livelihoods. There are big challenges in this sector, so let's be clear about that up front. There are some parts of blue food production, like bottom trawling, like industrial shrimp production, that are hugely destructive. So those need to be addressed. But blue foods are an immensely diverse sector. There are more than 2,500 species that are produced for food. And across that diversity is huge potential for us to find ways to create a food system that is healthy and sustainable and equitable. So the goal of the Blue Food Assessment, which we launched 3 years ago, was actually to illuminate these challenges and possibilities, to provide the basis for a broader array of decision makers to address the potential of blue foods and to bring that into their decisions. It was from the beginning about both research and engagement in tandem. So just as we launched the Blue Food Assessment, the Secretary General of the UN announced that he would convene in 18 months' time a UN Food Systems Summit. And so from the beginning, we initiated the research, but also initiated engagement with the summit preparatory process so that blue foods had its place in that agenda. I'm going to start first with the research, and this will be frustrating because I have to go through it very quickly, but you can find it all on bluefood.earth, which is the website for the Blue Food Assessment. Crucial to the research we did was a handful of collaborations. So we did this project in partnership with the Stockholm Resilience Center. The Blue Food Assessment was co-chaired by Ros Naylor and Bea Krona from Stockholm. We worked closely with WorldFish, which is on the ground in developing countries around the world and has immense research capability. And from the beginning, we worked with Springer Nature, the publishers of Nature. So they sent 4 editors to the first research workshop in which this agenda was developed. And then they had editors working with each of our research teams to help them identify pathways to publications for the work that they wanted to do. Now, in quick form, I'm going to take you through 6 of the papers. The first paper, On Demand. This was led by Ros Naylor. It tells us that we can expect demand for blue foods to double by 2050. But crucially, how that plays out will vary hugely around the world, according to which blue foods are accessible, according to cultural traditions, according to dietary preferences. So a much more granular understanding of those patterns will be essential to understanding what lies ahead. We also looked at production. Most people think about blue food production and have images like these. They think about industrial fisheries. They think about large-scale fish farms. In fact, most of the blue food we eat is produced by small-scale actors, and they account for 90% of the jobs in the sector. And so our paper, co-led by Fio Micheli, focused on understanding the small-scale fishery and aquaculture sector. And what it tells us by looking at 70 case studies from around the world is that this is, as you might expect, a hugely varied sector, and understanding that variety and understanding what it takes to support that sector and for those producers to thrive is actually critically important and largely ignored by policymakers. We also looked at justice. This paper came out in Nature Food last week, led by Christina Hicks at Lancaster. It looks at the economic, political, and social barriers to blue food benefits. And what it tells you, among other things, is that in one country after another, the pursuit of export revenues is coming at the expense of nutrition and food security and livelihoods in those countries. It's also telling you that gender, this will not surprise you, is chronically ignored, that women are almost invisible in this sector, even though they are 50% of the workforce, and they very rarely have a voice in governance. It also, though, looked at the policy regimes across 173 countries, and from that learned that actually when governments address these issues in policy, when they recognize food as a human right, for example, when they empower women and elevate them in governance, when they provide special preferences for marginalized populations in access to resources, for example, those policies work. You get better welfare benefits by addressing these issues directly. We, of course, address climate, and climate will have impacts for blue food systems, just as it does for every system. But what was novel in this analysis, led by Michelle Tickler from the COS staff, is that it looked at climate hazards to blue food systems in every country. So what will be the impacts of climate change on blue food systems? It then looked at the country's dependence on blue food systems for nutrition, livelihoods, food security. And it looked at the vulnerability of that country to those disruptions. How well equipped is that country for dealing with the problems that lie ahead? And when you look at those three things together, you get a map that looks like this, which tells you that every country is going to have challenges if we don't mitigate climate change by the middle of the century. But those challenges will be especially severe in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in the Indo-Pacific. We looked at environment, and there's a second paper coming out in environment hopefully later this year, but this first paper looked at, produced the first standardized estimates of environmental impacts for the blue food production systems that account for about 75% of all production worldwide. It tells us that most of those blue foods, almost all of those blue foods, are comparable to chicken in their environmental impacts, chicken being the most environmentally efficient terrestrial meat. But crucially, that there is potential for a lot of improvement in many of those sectors, and there are blue food systems that are just intrinsically much more sustainable. And finally, nutrition. Chris Golden of Harvard, Zach Kane of Stanford put together the most comprehensive database ever assembled on blue food nutrition. It is scores of nutrients across 3,500 different blue foods, and on that basis allowed a comparison of how blue foods stack up against terrestrial sources of protein. And what you can see is the top several categories, almost all the categories of blue foods are better than beef, right? That they are rich not only in protein, but in omega-3s, of course, but also vitamin A, B12, zinc, calcium, a critical set of micronutrients, and therefore offer lots of opportunities for thinking about future diets. To take one example, this little fish, which is called the mola, is grown in carp ponds in Bangladesh. Carp is the commercial product sold in the market. Mola provides the nutrition. It accounts for more than 90% of the vitamin A in the diet of Bangladesh. So the first 5 articles were published a week before the UN Food Systems Summit, September 2021. Nature put blue foods on the cover. They ran an editorial on the importance of blue foods. They mounted an immersive website that took the data from these 5 articles and made it accessible and interactive for anyone who came to the website. So did a lot to elevate this science in terms of in media and going into the summit. Let me then say a little bit about what this means for policymakers. I mean, what is the point? For a health minister, there are health ministers all over the world that are facing critical deficiencies in nutrients in their population, especially for children under the age of 5. In many of those countries, they could solve those nutrient deficiencies by making better use of the resources in their waters. For an environment minister, he knows already, or she knows already, that mangroves are important to coastal protection, but they also underpin the livelihoods, food security, and health of many coastal communities in a way that doesn't show up in national economic planning. And for a fisheries minister, there may be a natural tendency to focus on industrial production, but it's the small fishers that really matter in terms of the health and livelihoods and food security of his communities. And finally, there is in this space actually a fair amount of opportunity for win-wins, which doesn't happen often in our business. There are trade-offs to be sure, but there are lots of cases where you can serve more than one goal at once. So one example is this. Better management of fisheries to reduce overfishing is good for ocean health, but it also reduces CO2 emissions because fishers spend less time on the water to catch their quota. Right? Growing mollusks, mussels and other mollusks, is superfood nutrition. It's top of the charts in nutrition, but also a much lighter ecological footprint than any other system. Ensuring the empowerment of women is, of course, important for equity. It actually also improves food security in their households and in their communities. Now, let me say, finally, a little bit about how we took this into the policy process. As I mentioned, the Food System Summit was announced just as we launched this work. We engaged the preparatory process from the very beginning. A core partner for us was the World Economic Forum. And when the UN Ocean Conference in 2020 was postponed, the World Economic Forum convened a virtual ocean dialogue. And that provided this platform, which is Roz Naylor and Shakuntala Tilsted, two of our lead scientists, with the special envoy for the Food System Summit, Agnes Kalibata, and the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, talking about the importance of blue foods. So a chance to, from the beginning, put this high on the sort of policymaker agenda. And then we have worked with a series of partners, these are the four most important, together to bring blue foods into those Food System Summit preparatory discussions. So of course, with the World Economic Forum, with EAT, which is an important food convener in Europe, with WWF and EDF, we worked hand in hand through the whole summit process to make sure that blue foods was in the agenda and was advanced through that process. So let me say a little bit about impact. It is early days, right? What we have done is cracked open the door, but we have some at least encouraging first signs of progress. One is that at the summit, it was announced, a Blue Food Coalition was announced. It was then launched at the UN Ocean Conference in June. It brings together at this point 10 countries, including the US and the EU, along with an array of civil society organizations committed to working together to continue to elevate blue foods in the international agenda and to support countries who are acting on blue food priorities. The Global Environment Facility just put together its strategy for the next 4 years. It's a $5 billion program and now has blue foods, much more prominent than they've been before. Similar with the USAID Global Food Security, just refreshed by the Biden administration. When the G20 meets next month in Bali, Indonesia will launch the Ocean 20 as a standing platform in the G20 ecosystem. Blue foods is one of the featured priorities in the launch of that platform. And we have a TV series coming to a streaming service near you, Fed by Blue, 4 episodes focused on the possibilities and challenges of blue foods. So let me just say a little bit about why we think this is interesting and important. First is where I started. I mean, somehow we have to reach decision makers where they are. So illuminating the relevance of our concerns to their concerns is really central. And in this case, we're starting with policymakers, but the same principle applies to others. The second is that there's a lot of opportunity in pursuing science and engagement in tandem, and that takes many different forms. In this case, it was engagement that lay the groundwork for bringing the science to those policymakers when it was done. And then finally, it is, of course, all about partnerships. And that was true on the research side, both partnerships with more than 100 scientists around the world who were part of producing these papers, but also the collaboration with nature, which helped us ensure that we could attract those scientists and that the work they did would get the attention that it deserved. And obviously on the action side, we're not going to go into a summit process by ourselves, but working with NGO partners, we can actually do a lot to make sure that the science filters in to that process. Thank you.